In the fall of 1983, the Super 8 film section of a typical American camera store occupied 4 linear feet of shelf space. By Christmas of 1984, it occupied 1. By Christmas of 1985, in most American camera stores, it was gone. Not reorganized, not discounted. Gone, replaced by a single end cap of VHS camcorder accessories for machines that Bell and Howell did not make. The company that had put a motion picture camera in the hands of American fathers for 60 years had lost the American home movie market in fewer than 36 months. A decade earlier, that same company had been manufacturing Super 8 film cameras in Chicago, Illinois, selling them through 12,000 American camera dealers and processing the film that ran through them via a national network of photo finishing labs that handled 1 billion feet of Super 8 film per year. 1 billion feet. Enough film laid end to end to circle the Earth 40 times. All of it recording the same subject, American children in American backyards and American living rooms, on American Christmas mornings, squinting into the light of a Bell and Howell camera held by someone who loved them. But the real story of Bell and Howell is not the collapse of the Super 8 market in 3 holiday seasons. It is the story of what American families were actually recording and what it cost when the machine that recorded it was suddenly completely and irreversibly gone. Somewhere in a plastic bin, in a storage unit, in a shoebox, on a closet shelf, in a banker's box labeled "Home Movies Do Not Throw Away," there are Super 8 film reels in small yellow Kodak boxes that have not been projected in 40 years. They exist because an American company in Chicago, Illinois built the camera. They exist because an American company in Rochester, New York made the film. The images are still there, waiting on a light source. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of the American companies that built the cameras, the film, and the projectors that recorded American life, and what happened to those companies when the market moved on without them. Like the video and subscribe if that history matters to you. This story begins in Chicago, Illinois in 1907. Donald Bell was a movie projectionist. Albert Howell was a machinist. In 1907, they were both employed by the S&A Film Manufacturing Company in Chicago, Illinois, one of the early American film studios, the company that would later sign Charlie Chaplin and produce some of the first American westerns. Bell watched the projectors break. Howell fixed them. Between them, they understood something that no one in the American motion picture equipment industry had yet solved: the intermittent mechanism. The claw that pulled each frame of film into the gate held it steady for a fraction of a second, while the shutter opened, then advanced to the next frame, was the most mechanically critical and most chronically unreliable component in the entire chain of motion picture production. If the intermittent claw was imprecise by a fraction of a millimeter, the projected image shook. If it was imprecise by more, the film tore. Bell and Howell believed they could build a more precise mechanism than anything available in 1907. They left S&A and incorporated the Bell and Howell Company at 319 East Madison Street, Chicago, Illinois, in the spring of that year. Their first product was not a camera. It was a film perforator, a machine that punched the sprocket holes in raw film stock with a dimensional accuracy that the American motion picture industry had not previously achieved. The perforator was adopted by Eastman Kodak for its own film stock production within 2 years of its introduction. When the company that made the film adopts your machine to make the film, you have established yourself. The Bell & Howell Model 2709 35mm professional motion picture camera followed in 1912. It was the first American motion picture camera built to tolerances precise enough to allow the interchangeable use of multiple camera bodies on a single production without visible registration differences between shots. Every Hollywood studio adopted it. For the next 15 years, the Model 2709 was the standard professional motion picture camera in the United States. The United States Army Signal Corps contracted Bell & Howell for cameras and film equipment beginning in 1917 during the First World War. The federal relationship that would endure through every subsequent American military conflict for the next 50 years. But the professional motion picture camera was not the product that built Bell & Howell's relationship with the American family. That product arrived in 1921. The Bell Howell Filmo 70 was a 16mm film camera, 16mm meaning a film strip, 16mm wide, half the width of the 35mm professional standard, and therefore half the cost per foot to manufacture and process. The Filmo 70 weighed 3 pounds. It ran on a spring-wound motor. It required no external power source, no film magazine larger than a shirt pocket, and no technical expertise beyond loading the daylight loading spool, a design that allowed film to be loaded in ordinary room light without a darkroom or a changing bag. At $185 in 1923, roughly $3,300 in today's dollars, the Filmo 70 was not an inexpensive instrument, but it was the first motion picture camera an American who was not a professional filmmaker could reasonably operate. The United States Navy purchased Filmo 70 cameras for shipboard documentation in 1922. The National Geographic Society used them for expedition photography beginning in 1923. Robert Flaherty shot portions of Nanook of the North with a Filmo. Martin and Osa Johnson carried them to East Africa. By 1926, Bell Howell employed 400 people at its Chicago facilities. By 1935, that number was over 1,200. The American family had not yet acquired a Bell Howell camera. That was about to change. In 1932, Eastman Kodak introduced the 8mm film format, a 16mm film strip that was run through the camera twice, exposing half the frame width on each pass, then split lengthwise during processing to produce a film strip 8mm wide. The smaller format meant smaller cameras, smaller projectors, and film that cost half as much per minute of running time as 16mm. Bell Howell introduced its first 8mm consumer camera, the Filmo Straight 8, in 1935. The American home movie had arrived. It cost $47.50 in 1935, approximately $1,050 in today's dollars. It was purchased primarily through camera dealers' department stores and the Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward mail-order catalogs. By 1940, Bell Howell was shipping consumer 8mm cameras to over 3,000 American retail accounts. The machine was in American hands. Now it needed a subject. In the summer of 1965, Eastman Kodak introduced a new 8mm film format and called it Super 8. The name was accurate. Super 8, a film cartridge containing 8mm wide film designed to drop into the camera in a single motion and load automatically without threading, without touching the film surface, without any procedure that required knowledge of how the mechanism worked, was not simply a better film format. It was a different proposition entirely. Standard 8mm film. The format that Bell Howell and every other American home movie camera manufacturer had used since 1932 required the photographer to load a spool thread the film leader through a gate and over a sprocket, attach the leader to a take-up spool, close the camera, and advance several frames to clear the exposed leader before beginning to shoot. In a car, in dim light, with children waiting, Super 8 required none of this. The cartridge, a molded plastic shell roughly the size of a deck of cards, dropped into the camera's loading bay, clicked into place, and was done. The camera recognized the film's ASA speed, rating its sensitivity to light from a notch cut into the cartridge. The exposure was set automatically. In a 1965 Bell Howell Super 8 camera, a person who had never operated a movie camera in their life could load a roll of film and begin shooting in under 30 seconds. This was not a technical improvement. It was the elimination of the barrier between the American family and the motion picture camera. Bell Howell's response to the Super 8 format was the 8mm auto-load camera line, later refined into the Optronic Eye series cameras that used an electric eye, a light-sensitive cell mounted on the camera body that automatically adjusted the iris, the aperture opening that controlled how much light reached the film based on the available light. Point the camera, press the button. The machine handled the rest. The Bell Howell auto-load Super 8 cameras retailed between $39.95 and $119.95 depending on the model and zoom lens specification. The entry-level model at $39.95 in 1968, roughly $350 in today's dollars, was priced within reach of any American family that had a color television set. And by 1968, most American families had a color television set. The film that ran through the camera cost $3.50 per 50-foot cartridge, approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds of footage at the standard 18 frames per second silent speed. Processing was included in the purchase price. The exposed cartridge went into a mailer into a mailbox and came back in 10 days as a processed film reel ready to project. $3.50, 10 days, 3 minutes and 20 seconds of your children's lives in color projected on a bedsheet. The American moat, the competitive position that Bell Howell held through the late 1960s, was not the camera body. Japanese manufacturers were already building competitive Super 8 cameras under their own brands. Canon, Chinon, Minolta, Elmo. The moat was the distribution network. Bell Howell cameras were sold through Sears Roebuck on an exclusive arrangement that placed Bell Howell branded Super 8 cameras manufactured in Japan under Bell Howell specifications, but carrying the Bell Howell nameplate in the camera department of every Sears store in America. In 1970, Sears operated 868 stores in the United States. Every one of them sold Bell Howell Super 8 cameras. The specific American institutions that standardized on Bell Howell motion picture equipment during this period were not marginal accounts. The United States Army Signal Corps, which had used Bell Howell 16mm cameras since 1917, continued to purchase Bell Howell equipment for training film production through the 1960s. The United States Navy photographic units carried Bell Howell filmo cameras on ships and aircraft for documentation through the Korean War and into Vietnam. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Technical Photography Unit used Bell Howell 16mm equipment for surveillance and evidence documentation. Every major American television network, ABC, CBS, NBC, used Bell Howell 16mm cameras for news gathering before the ENG, electronic news gathering videotape camera, replaced film in the news workflow in the late 1970s. And in American schools, Bell Howell projectors, the FilmaSound 385, the TQ series, equipped the audio-visual department of every American school district that could afford one. The name on the camera was not simply a city of origin. It was a standard. Between 1965 and 1980, Super 8 film, most of it manufactured by Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York, running through cameras built in Japan under American brand names including Bell and Howell, was the medium in which American family life was recorded. Not photographed, recorded. The distinction matters. A photograph is a moment. A film is duration. A child blowing out birthday candles in a photograph is an image. A child blowing out birthday candles in a Super 8 film is a child blowing out birthday candles. The breath. The candles going out, one by one. The grandmother leaning in to help with the last two. The child turning toward the camera with chocolate frosting already on the chin, laughing at something only the living room knows. The photograph preserves the fact. The film preserves the life. By 1970, Eastman Kodak's Super 8 film division was processing over 200 million cartridges of Super 8 film per year at its Qualex photo finishing facilities. Qualex being Kodak's wholly owned network of film processing labs, the largest film processing operation in the world. Bell Howell's consumer camera division was shipping cameras through more than 8,000 American retail accounts. The company employed approximately 6,500 people at its Chicago headquarters and manufacturing facilities on Larchmont Avenue in Chicago, Illinois. At its peak, Bell Howell's consumer camera and projector division was the largest American-branded home movie equipment operation in the country. The institutions that made this scale possible were not only retailers. The United States military had used Bell Howell 16mm equipment for training film production since the First World War, and that relationship extended through the Korean conflict. The Army Signal Corps alone held procurement contracts for Bell Howell. Filmo cameras. FilmaSound projectors and film editing equipment that ran without interruption from 1917 to the 1960s. Every American classroom with an audio-visual program knew the Bell Howell FilmaSound projector, the machine that the AV student rolled out of the storage closet on its aluminum cart, threaded with the reel the teacher had ordered from the district film library, and started with a push of a button while the lights went down and the room became for 20 minutes a small theater. The FilmaSound 385 and its successors were the projectors that showed American schoolchildren the grapes of wrath. NASA moon landing footage, driver's education films, and health class films, whose titles are still remembered with acute discomfort by anyone who sat through them in 1971. The American Red Cross trained its first aid instructors with Bell Howell projectors. The Ford Motor Company equipped its dealer training facilities with Bell Howell 16mm equipment beginning in the 1940s. The United States Department of Agriculture's Extension Service, the rural education program that reached American farmers and ranchers in every county in the country, distributed educational films to local screening events on Bell Howell projectors that traveled in the back of county agent pickup trucks. These were not niche markets. They were the visual communication infrastructure of American institutional life. But it is not these institutions that define Bell Howell's place in the American memory. It is the living room. In the fall of 1966, in a subdivision outside of Dayton, Ohio, a man named Robert or Donald or William or James, he is every father of that decade, stood in the backyard with a Bell Howell Super 8 camera and filmed his daughter taking her first steps across a patch of crabgrass toward a lawn chair. The footage runs for approximately 45 seconds. The little girl falls twice, gets up both times. On the third attempt, she makes it to the chair and grabs it with both hands and turns around. And in that turn, that specific quarter turn of a toddler who has just discovered that her legs work, she looks directly into the camera lens with an expression that contains in 45 seconds of silent Super 8 film the entirety of what it meant to be alive in an American backyard in 1966. The camera that recorded it used Kodachrome 40 Super 8 film. Kodachrome, the color reversal film stock, whose saturated yellows and warm magentas defined the visual palette of American family memory for 40 years. It was processed by Kodak's Qualix laboratory in a facility outside Columbus, Ohio, returned in a small yellow box, and projected on a Bell Howell Super 8 projector in the same living room on a bedsheet tacked to the wall 3 weeks later. The total cost $3.50 for the film. Mailing, processing. Returned in the purchase price. The child in the film is now in her 60s. The film still exists in a small yellow Kodak box in a drawer somewhere. The father is gone. The Bell Howell Company, the company that made the camera that recorded the moment, is gone in any photographic sense. The Kodak Qualix lab that processed the film is gone. The camera store that sold the camera is gone. The 45 seconds remain. To understand what Bell Howell represented in the American home, not in the institutional catalog, not in the military procurement schedule, but in the actual American home, you had to be there when the projector came out. The Bell Howell Super 8 projector started with a fan, a small cooling fan that came on first before the lamp, creating a low electric hum that meant something specific if you heard it in a darkened living room on a Saturday evening. The movies were about to start. Then the lamp, a sudden white rectangle on the wall, or on the portable screen that came out of its aluminum sleeve and clicked into position on its tripod legs. A rectangle of pure projected light, empty, slightly warm, smelling the heat of the tungsten bulb, mixing with the slight chemical smell of the acetate film base. Then the film, the leader, counting down the sprocket holes flickering past the gate for a moment before the first image appeared, slightly too bright, slightly too fast, always slightly too fast, because whoever loaded the reel had set the speed lever to 24 frames per second instead of 18, and someone had to get up and adjust it while everyone else called out adjustments from the couch. Then the image settled, and there was the birthday party from 3 years ago, the Christmas morning from 1971. The beach vacation where it rained for 4 days, your cousin's wedding, your grandmother's last healthy summer, waving from a porch chair, looking directly into the camera, laughing at something the film doesn't know what. It never knew what, but she's laughing. She's alive. She's waving at you across a distance of time that no digital format has ever quite managed to collapse in the same way. The Super 8 projector image was not sharp. It was not stable. It flickered at the edges and faded in the center. It was by every objective measure of image quality inferior to what a VHS camcorder would offer a decade later. It was also the only moving image of your grandmother waving. No one who watched those films in a darkened American living room in 1973 would trade the flicker for a sharper image. Bell Howell's peak employment in Chicago was approximately 6,500 employees in its photographic manufacturing and distribution divisions by the early 1970s. The company's consumer products division cameras, projectors, and associated equipment accounted for a substantial share of its annual revenue, which by 1973 had reached approximately $400 million across all divisions. The 8,000 American camera dealers who carried Bell & Howell products represented a national service and repair network technicians who could clean, lubricate, and adjust a Bell & Howell projector's intermittent mechanism, replace a lamp, realign a Super 8 film gate. The knowledge was local, the parts were available, the machine could be kept alive for decades. In 1978, that network was intact. In 1988, it was largely gone. The decade between those 2 years is the story of how a market that Bell & Howell had served for 60 years ended not slowly, not in stages, but in a single holiday season. The warning arrived in the summer of 1980. Sony Corporation of Japan introduced the Betamovie BMC-100P at the Photokina trade exhibition in Cologne, West Germany. It was a video camera, a camera that recorded moving images not onto film, but onto magnetic videotape, specifically the Betamax cassette format that Sony had introduced for home VCRs in 1975. The Betamovie rested on the shoulder. It required no film, no processing, no projector, no darkroom, no chemical knowledge of any kind. You pressed record, you pressed stop, you connected the camera to your television set with a cable. The image appeared on the screen, your television screen, the screen every American family already owned immediately, instantly, that afternoon. Not in 10 days from the Kodak Qualex lab in Columbus, that afternoon. Bell & Howell's internal response to the Betamovie announcement was, by accounts of the period, a recognition that the product was real, but that its price, approximately $1,500 at American retail introduction in 1983, would limit its market to affluent early adopters. This was not wrong. In 1983 it was not wrong. It was, however, the last year it was not wrong. The pivot Bell & Howell attempted was not a camera. In the early 1980s, the company's leadership made the decision to diversify away from photographic manufacturing and into business document systems, specifically mail processing equipment, document scanning systems, and library microfilm equipment. The logic was defensible. Bell & Howell's precision manufacturing expertise, the same mechanical engineering tradition that had produced the 1912 Model 2709 professional camera, was applicable to any mechanism that moved paper or film through a precisely controlled transport system. Mail sorters, microfilm cameras, document feeders. The mechanism was the mechanism. The problem was that the camera business did not wait for the pivot to complete. In 1984, the Panasonic P5 200 VHS movie camera arrived in American Sears stores, the same Sears stores that had exclusively carried Bell & Howell Super 8 cameras for 15 years, at $999, $1,000 for a camera that recorded directly to VHS tape, played back on the family VCR, required no film, no processing, no mailer, no waiting. The Sears camera department buyer did not need a market research report. The Super 8 camera section began to shrink. Eastman Kodak's Super 8 film division processed 200 million cartridges in 1978. By 1985, that number was 50 million. By 1990, it was fewer than 5 million. The 200 photo finishing labs that had processed Super 8 film at peak closed one by one. The Kodak Qualex facilities that had returned processed film in small yellow boxes shut down their Super 8 lines and then eventually shut down entirely. The numbers accelerated downward, every year faster. Bell & Howell's final consumer Super 8 camera, a camera manufactured in Japan under the Bell & Howell name, distributed through a retail network that was itself collapsing, as camera dealers closed, was discontinued in 1986. The company that had introduced Americans to home movies in 1921 exited the home movie market 65 years later, not with an announcement, not with a final model. The product simply stopped appearing in the catalog. The cascade moved outward from the camera. The American camera dealer who had sold Bell & Howell Super 8 cameras and projectors, who had stocked film lamp replacements, splicing tape, film cement editing blocks, and titling kits, lost not one product line but an entire equipment ecosystem. The film, the cartridges, the projector lamps, the screen, the editing supplies, the splicing tape, the Kodak mailer, all of it. 12,000 independent American camera dealers were in operation in 1975. By 2000, fewer than 2,000 remained. The closures were not evenly distributed over those 25 years. The decade of 1985 to 1995, the decade in which Super 8 film collapsed and consumer digital photography had not yet arrived to replace it, was when the majority closed. The camera repair technician lost a profession, not the skills, the profession. The intermittent mechanism of a Bell Howell Super 8 projector required specialized knowledge, claw geometry, film gate tolerances, shutter timing, lamp replacement procedures specific to the Osram or GE tungsten halogen lamp in a specific projector model. These were skills earned over years and documented in service manuals that Bell Howell printed in Chicago and distributed to authorized repair centers. When the projectors stopped being used, the manuals became curiosities. The technicians retired without successors. The school darkroom teacher, who had taught generations of American students to develop film, lost the darkroom when the school board replaced it with a computer lab. The Kodak color chemist in Rochester, who had managed the emulsion consistency of Super 8 Kodachrome to within microns across a production run of 50,000 feet of raw film stock, lost a job category. Not a job category. The photo finishing counter employee, the person who took the yellow Kodak mailer at the camera store counter, tagged it, and handed back the processed reel. 10 days later, lost a profession that had not existed before 1935 and ceased to exist after 1995. These were American professional categories. They had certification programs, they had professional associations, they had trade publications, they had 30-year careers and retirement parties. They did not retire on schedule, they were made obsolete. The Bell Howell Company did not go bankrupt, it survived transformed. By the 1990s, it was a different company, a document management and mail processing equipment manufacturer that happened to share its name with the company that had filmed American childhoods for 60 years. The camera division was gone. The projector division was gone. The trade name on the consumer product line was licensed to other manufacturers. Bell and Howell branded televisions and DVD players appeared in American discount stores in the 2000s. Products that had no mechanical relationship to the company that had built the Film 070. The name was a container. The content had been emptied. The cameras are still out there. A Bell Howell Super 8 camera in clean working condition, the Autoload series. The Optronic Eye models, the zoom lens variants that filled the Sears catalog pages of the early 1970s, appears on eBay listings several dozen times a week. Prices range from $15 to $65 depending on condition and whether the camera includes its original carrying case. Most buyers are not 50 years old. Many are in their 20s. Film photography's revival. The analog movement that gathered strength through the 2000s and accelerated during the pandemic years extended to Super 8 motion picture film in a way that the consumer electronics industry did not anticipate and cannot adequately serve. Kodak reintroduced Super 8 film in 2017. It is manufactured in limited quantities. It is processed by a handful of surviving specialty labs, Pro 8mm in Burbank, California, Duane's Photo in Parsons, Kansas before its 2023 closure, a small number of European processing operations. It is expensive. A single 50-foot cartridge, 3 minutes and 20 seconds of film, costs approximately $25 to $30 plus processing. A generation that grew up with the iPhone is loading it into 40-year-old Bell Howell cameras and filming their friends in California backyards. The Film Photography Project, filmphotographyproject.com, maintains an active community of American analog photographers and filmmakers who document the equipment, the film stocks, the processing labs, and the technique. Super 8 is a discussed and practiced medium there, not a museum exhibit. The George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, the world's oldest photography museum located on the grounds of George Eastman's personal estate, holds one of the most comprehensive collections of Bell Howell motion picture equipment in the world. The Film 070, the Model 2709, the consumer Super 8 cameras of every era, the projectors, the service manuals. They are in climate-controlled storage. They are not being used. The surprise in the Bell Howell legacy is what the company's engineers actually built. The Model 2709 professional motion picture camera of 1912. The camera that Bell Howell built for Hollywood studios was so precisely manufactured that its film registration tolerances were not meaningfully surpassed by competing designs for 30 years. When film preservation specialists at the UCLA Film and Television Archive examined early Hollywood productions for restoration, they found that the negative film stocks shot on Bell and Howell Model 2709 cameras, camera bodies that are now over a century old, retained dimensional stability superior to many subsequent camera designs. A camera built in Chicago in 1912 to tolerances established by a machinist and a projectionist who had worked for a silent film studio on Madison Street was still producing images sharp enough to scan at 4K resolution 100 years later. The machine was that good. The machine was American. The skills that vanished with the Bell and Howell home movie ecosystem were not only technical. The Bell and Howell 16mm film editor, who cut documentary footage on a flatbed editing table, who physically handled film, who held frames up to the light to examine them, who marked cut points with a white grease pencil and made the splice with a film cement that smelled faintly of acetone, possessed a physical, tactile relationship with the medium that no digital editing interface has replicated. The school audio-visual technician, who could thread a Bell and Howell film-a-sound projector in the dark, who knew by feel when the film had seated correctly in the gate, who could change a projection lamp while it was still warm, who could manually rock the take-up reel to find a jammed splice, possessed skills that were invisible as long as they were common. When they were no longer common, they became rare. When they became rare, they became lost. The high school photography teacher who taught students to develop 16mm reversal film in a Bell and Howell processing tank under red safe light, timing the chemical steps by the sweep second hand of the darkroom clock, the teacher retired sometime between 1990 and 2005 when the school darkroom became a storage closet for surplus computers. The knowledge retired with them. In a storage room in the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, there is a Bell and Howell Filmo 70 serial number from the early 1920s, the spring-wound 16mm camera that Robert Flaherty carried that the Signal Corps issued, that the National Geographic Society sent to East Africa in a leather carrying case with a shoulder strap worn smooth by decades of contact with the clothing of people whose names are no longer attached to the object. The spring is wound, the shutter fires clean. There is no film in the chamber. In the attic of a house in a suburb of Dayton, Ohio, there is a Super 8 reel in a small yellow Kodak box labeled in ballpoint pen in handwriting that is no longer anyone's handwriting. Amy First Steps, August 1966. The camera that made it was a Bell and Howell. The film that ran through it was Kodak Kodachrome. The image is still there. It is waiting for a light source and for someone who remembers what they are looking at. Every week on this channel, we return to the American companies that built the equipment that made those images possible. The cameras, the film, the projectors, the processing labs, the camera repair shops, the school darkrooms. And we tell the story of what happened to them when the market moved on. Sometimes the market moved on because of a better machine, sometimes because of a cheaper one, sometimes because of a machine no one in America had thought to build and someone in Japan had. Sometimes because of a machine the size of a paperback book that sits in everyone's pocket and shoots video in 4K and costs nothing per minute of footage and connects directly to every person you have ever met. The image that machine makes is sharp. It is stable. It is immediate. It does not smell of film cement or acetate or the particular warmth of a tungsten projection lamp heating up in a darkened American living room in 1973. Subscribe to keep hearing these stories. The next one begins in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1937.